Most people today imagine the medieval world as a place of clashing armies and towering castles. Yet the truth that lies beneath those familiar images is far quieter, far more human, and far easier to overlook. For the ordinary person, life unfolded in a hush shaped by routine, by weather, by hunger, and by the soft pressure of expectations that felt as old as the land itself. Each morning began not with excitement, but with the low rustle of people rising before dawn, their breaths visible in the cold air, their movements practiced and unspoken. In the half-light, the scent of damp straw clung to them, and the weight of simple tools rough-hewn, worn smooth by years of use, rested in their hands as naturally as their own shadows. They inherited a world that did not ask what they wanted. It asked for their endurance. Seasons were not gentle markers of time, but forces that shaped every task, from planting to gathering firewood. Harvests were fragile, threatened by storms or frost, and the fear of losing everything lingered silently beneath daily chores. Most people traveled little, their entire universe contained within the span of a few muddy paths and the fields that fed them. Silence became a kind of language, a way of moving through hardship without needing to name it. Yet within that quiet, there was a subtle resilience. People learned to read the wind, to sense changes in the soil, to recognize the difference between a good year and one that might test every part of them. They carried memories of times when food ran thin or illness crept through their homes, and these memories shaped how they taught their children to work, to wait, and to hope. Even simple acts, mending a fence, preparing a meal, tending a fire, held deeper meaning because so much relied on doing them well. Life was not filled with spectacle, but with countless small struggles repeated day after day. A family might spend an entire evening repairing tools by lamplight, knowing a single break could mean losing precious hours in the fields. A mother might rise in the night to check the embers in the hearth, aware that letting the fire die meant waking to a freezing room. A father might walk miles before sunrise to look after animals that depended entirely on his care. None of these moments appeared in chronicles or legend, yet they formed the real fabric of medieval existence. And so, woven between the hardship and the quiet, there was a steady rhythm that kept people moving forward. They rarely spoke of bravery, yet they practiced it daily in ways so ordinary they almost disappeared. As we step deeper into their world, it becomes clear that the greatest battles they faced were not fought with swords, but with patience, persistence, and an unspoken agreement to meet each morning as it came, even when dawn offered little comfort. From here, we can begin to understand what awaited them the moment they opened their eyes each day. Morning in the medieval world did not arrive gently. It crept in as a cold reminder that rest was only a brief pause, never a true escape. People woke long before the sun had even considered rising, stirred not by desire but by obligation. The darkness inside their homes matched the darkness outside, broken only by the faint glow of dying embers that had struggled through the night. Their first task was to coax those embers back to life, bending close to the hearth with chilled fingers, hoping the fire would catch before the cold settled deeper into their bones. The air inside the house held a sharp edge, touching skin like a warning. Floors were cold, often little more than packed earth or uneven planks that carried the memory of the night's chill. As people moved, their steps were quiet but purposeful, each motion shaped by the weight of tasks waiting beyond the doorway. They dressed quickly, pulling on garments that had never fully dried from the day before, garments that carried the scent of smoke, soil, and yesterday's work. There was no luxury of warm fabric or gentle light, only necessity. Before daylight, many had already tended to animals, checked tools, or stepped outside to fetch water. The path to a well could stretch farther than comfort allowed, yet the journey was made daily, morning after morning, with empty buckets that felt heavier simply because of what they demanded. The sound of those buckets, swaying a wooden creak echoing softly in the dark, was as much a part of dawn as the first call of a rooster. These were the routines that defined existence, long before the sky brightened enough to reveal the surrounding world. Even chores inside the home were shaped by the dimness. Repairing a strap, sweeping a floor, or preparing a small meal required patience and a kind of practiced calm. There was no rushing. There could not be. Life moved at the pace of hands, guided by memory more than sight. The day ahead would bring harder labor, but the morning still demanded a quiet strength, the kind that came from knowing that stopping, even briefly, meant falling behind on everything that mattered. The emotional weight of these early hours was something rarely spoken aloud. People did not lament their routines, yet the heaviness of waking to cold, darkness, and obligation carved something into them over time. Even children learned quickly that morning was not a gentle moment. It marked the beginning of work, and work marked the possibility of survival. There was no room for hesitation, and as the faintest grey touched the horizon, they carried their tools, their buckets, and their quiet endurance into the new day. Dawn did not bring ease. It simply illuminated what had already begun. From this understanding of their mornings, the question becomes clear. If each day started with such weight, what kind of refuge waited for them inside the homes they returned to each night? In the medieval world, the idea of home was far removed from the comfort the word suggests today. A house was not a sanctuary but a shelter, a place that shielded people from rain and wind yet rarely offered warmth or ease. Most dwellings were built from whatever the land provided: rough timber, packed earth, woven branches coated with mud, and roofs layered with straw or wooden shingles. These materials served their purpose, but they aged quickly. Walls bowed, floors shifted, and roofs leaked with an almost predictable stubbornness. Inside, the air felt thick, carrying the sense of smoke, dampness, and soil. Every corner held the quiet memory of seasons that had stripped the structure a little more. Light itself felt scarce. Many homes had only one small window, covered with oiled cloth or thin horn, that allowed a muted glow to pass through. Even at midday, interiors felt dim, shadows pooling in corners, shaping the atmosphere with quiet heaviness. Night turned these rooms into near darkness, broken only by the flicker of a hearth or the timid flame of a candle reserved for essential tasks. In this darkness, people moved by habit. They knew the creak of their own floorboards, the roughness of the table's edge, and the exact reach of the hearth's warmth. Their senses adjusted to a world where sight mattered far less than memory. The hearth dominated the living space. It was both the warmest point and the greatest hazard. Without proper chimneys, smoke filled the room, drifting upward and gathering beneath the rafters before slowly spreading into every corner. The smell of smoke soaked into clothing, walls, and hair. Eyes often burned, and breathing felt heavy during long winters, when fires could not be allowed to die. Yet the hearth was essential. It cooked meals, dried damp garments, and kept frost from creeping across the floor. Families relied on its glow for both warmth and a sense of safety, even as they accepted the discomfort it brought. Bedding offered little relief from the day's labor. Mattresses were sacks of straw that flattened quickly, needing to be refilled or shaken out regularly. Insects hid within the layers, biting through the night. Blankets were coarse wool, warm enough to endure the cold but rough against the skin. People slept fully clothed for warmth, curling close together on shared bedding to preserve heat. Every movement caused the straw beneath them to rustle softly, a constant reminder that even rest was work. Sleep came in fragments, shaped by necessity rather than luxury. Animals often shared the living space, not out of affection, but necessity. Goats, chickens, or a cow were kept indoors during harsh weather for protection and warmth, their breath adding to the room's humidity. The sounds of shifting hooves or quiet snorts were part of the nightly soundscape, mixed with the distant howl of wind or the soft drip of water finding its way through a crack in the roof. The blending of human and animal life created an environment that felt both crowded and strangely intimate. Despite these hardships, the home carried a certain resilience. Families repaired their walls each spring, patched leaks with careful hands, and refreshed their straw bedding with what little they could spare. Every improvement, however small, made daily life a fraction more bearable. These actions formed a quiet ritual of hope, a belief that a slightly stronger roof, or a better sealed window, might soften the seasons ahead. The work invested into maintaining the home added layers of meaning to its battered structure. Still, one could never fully forget the discomfort it held. Rainy nights brought the tapping of water seeping through weak spots in the roof, each drip a reminder of how thin the boundary was between inside and out. During storms, wind pressed against the walls with unsettling determination, making the house tremble slightly as though breathing with its inhabitants. Even the fire, their most precious ally, demanded constant attention to prevent disaster. Sparks could leap unexpectedly, turning a moment of carelessness into tragedy. In this world, safety was something earned through vigilance. But perhaps the most telling aspect of medieval homes was how they shaped people's understanding of rest. Sleep was not guaranteed or predictable. It often came in brief waves, interrupted by cold, by noise, or by the restless movements of others nearby. People woke frequently to check embers, adjust bedding, or calm an animal. In this restless pattern, rest became something pursued rather than possessed. Moments of real comfort were rare enough to feel precious, almost sacred. Yet for all its hardships, the home remained the one place where people felt a sense of belonging. No matter how uncomfortable, it was where life unfolded softly. One task, one breath, one night at a time. And as we leave this dimly lit space and step back into the world outside, we begin to understand why daily survival demanded such strength. Their homes protected them, but they also reminded them constantly of the world's harshness. This truth shaped everything they faced beyond the doorstep, a reality waiting in the fields, in the forests, and in the fragile rhythms of the coming day. The rhythm of medieval life was held together, not by grand events, but by the chores that filled every hour. These tasks were so ordinary that no one bothered to write them down, yet they shaped each day with quiet insistence. People woke into a world already demanding their attention. Before thoughts could settle, the chores waited, tending fires, gathering wood, feeding animals, sweeping floors, repairing small breaks that yesterday's work had left behind. Nothing existed in isolation. If a single task was ignored, something else became harder, and the delicate balance of the household shifted. The day often began with gathering water, a chore both simple and exhausting. The path to a well or stream was worn by countless feet, yet never grew easier. Empty buckets swung at a person's sides, knocking gently with each step. The return trip felt heavier, not only from the weight of the water but from knowing the journey would be repeated many times before nightfall. Water was needed for cooking, washing, brewing, cleaning, tending animals, and sometimes cooling a fever. Every drop mattered, and every drop had to be carried by hand. Firewood followed the same pattern. Wood had to be chopped, gathered, or bargained for, and storing enough for winter became a constant source of worry. Even in warmer months, fires needed fuel, and someone always had to fetch it. Children carried small bundles, while adults hauled larger loads on their backs. The crack of splitting wood echoed through many villages, a steady reminder of the work that never paused. Without enough fuel, meals went uncooked, laundry went undone, and warmth slipped away too quickly. Animals required their share of attention as well. A family's survival depended on their livestock, and neglecting them meant risking hunger later. Goats and sheep needed grazing, chickens required feeding, and cattle demanded constant care. People cleaned pens, checked for injuries, and watched for signs of sickness. In many ways, the animals' needs came before their own. A cow that fell ill could mean losing milk. A sick chicken meant fewer eggs. Everything connected back to survival, quietly, without urgency yet without mercy. Inside the home, chores gathered like dust. Floors were swept with simple brooms made from bundled twigs. Straw bedding had to be shaken, cleaned, or replaced. Tools needed sharpening. Clothing tore easily, and each stitch of repair took time. Food preparation filled hours each day. Grinding grain into flour, fetching herbs, and stirring pots over uneven fires required patience. These tasks were slow and repetitive, but they carried a subtle rhythm that shaped the day. Even rest demanded work. The hearth fire needed tending throughout the evening, nudging embers, adding wood, ensuring the warmth did not fade before dawn. A poorly maintained fire meant waking to cold that sank deep into the bones. Families moved through each day not with urgency but with steady purpose, aware that there was no pause button in their world. The moment they stopped, work accumulated like a tide rising silently around them. Yet within all this labor, there was something strangely grounding. People moved in harmony with the land, the weather, and each other. They knew the sound of wind before storms, the scent of soil before planting, the feel of wool before spinning. Their chores connected them to cycles older than memory. Still, the weight of constant work wore on them, shaping their posture, their hands, their thoughts. Even children learned their roles early, carrying small burdens that prepared them for larger ones. These chores formed the invisible foundation of medieval life. Without them, nothing else could stand. And while they rarely appeared in records or stories, they defined each person more deeply than any legend ever could. As we step into the next part of their daily reality, a question lingers quietly. If work consumed so much of their day, what dangers waited during the simplest tasks, threatening to turn routine into crisis? In a world without machines or safety tools, every moment of medieval labor carried a quiet, persistent risk. People understood this instinctively. They felt it each time they lifted an axe, each time they walked along a muddy path, each time they reached into a pot over the fire. Injury was not an exception but an expectation, an invisible cost woven into every task. Even the simplest chores held the potential to shift a family's fate, and this awareness settled over daily life like a shadow that never fully disappeared. A single misstep while chopping wood could split a hand rather than a log. A moment of distraction while tending animals could lead to a kick, a bite, or a bone-deep bruise. Handling hot pots over uneven hearths meant burns were common. People carried scars as naturally as they carried the tools of their trade, reminders of past mistakes and warnings for future caution. Yet caution could only do so much. Tools were crude, floors were uneven, and the environment offered no protection. Every action required balance, strength, and a kind of practiced vigilance that was exhausting in its own way. Infections were the most feared outcome. A cut on a foot from a sharp stone, a splinter driven beneath the skin, or a scrape from a rusted tool could be more dangerous than the injury itself. Without clean water or proper treatment, wounds often worsened quietly, turning red, warm, and swollen. People watched anxiously for signs, spreading discoloration, fever, the slow weakness that told them something inside the body was changing. Once infection took hold, hope narrowed quickly. The remedies available were modest herbal poultices, whispered prayers, or the simple act of waiting. Many families learned to recognize the tremor of dread that accompanied such uncertainty. Burns carried their own dangers. Fires were unforgiving, and the hearth dominated daily life. A slip while lifting a pot, a spark landing on fabric, or a child wandering too close could lead to injuries that lingered for weeks. Even mild burns slowed work, and serious ones often spiraled into infection or lasting disability. People learned to endure pain quietly, not out of stoicism but necessity. Complaints did little when the chores still needed doing. A burned hand might still gather herbs, wash clothes, or carry buckets because the alternative was falling behind. And falling behind was a risk no household could afford. Animals so essential to survival posed another constant threat. Cows stepped unpredictably, sheep kicked when startled, and pigs bit with surprising force. A single injury from livestock could mean a broken bone or deep bruise, impairing work for days or even weeks. And without consistent help available, others in the family had to absorb the extra labor, stretching themselves thin. The emotional weight of this was heavy. Guilt for the injured, fear for the consequences, and worry about how long recovery might take. Illness hovered just as closely. Cold weather brought coughing fits that never quite healed. Damp homes stirred joint pain and lingering fevers. Stomach ailments spread through families quickly, sometimes linked to food spoiling faster than people realized. Medieval people recognized patterns. They knew which symptoms might fade and which signaled darker possibilities, but their knowledge offered reassurance only up to a point. When sickness deepened, families often felt time slow, each hour marked by uncertainty, each breath taken with quiet hope. Still, people continued their tasks. They lifted tools with sore hands, walked miles on aching feet, and carried burdens even when their bodies begged for rest. Survival demanded that pain be folded into the larger rhythm of life, and beneath that rhythm lay a truth few dared to speak, that each day balanced on the edge of misfortune. Every chore, no matter how ordinary, offered a reminder of how fragile life could be. As we move forward, another question rises. If work and injury shaped adulthood so intensely, what happened to those who were already fragile, the young, the aging, and the overlooked members of medieval society? In a world where every pair of hands mattered, fragility held no special place. The young, the old, and those whose bodies did not match the demands of daily labor still carried the weight of survival, not because they chose to, but because the village itself depended on them. Childhood, as we imagine it today, did not exist. Instead, children slipped quietly into the rhythm of work, learning by watching, copying, and stumbling through chores that shaped their earliest memories. A child might carry water in small clay cups, gather herbs from the edges of fields, or scare birds away from crops. Their tasks were modest, yet each one filled a gap that adults had no time to fill. Parents understood that childhood ended quickly. A few missteps, a few mornings of hesitation, and a family could fall behind. So children learned early to move with purpose, even when their legs were tired, even when they longed for rest. Their small contributions softened the edges of adult labor, but they never erased it. And in the tired eyes of these young workers, one can sense a quiet truth. They did not dream of ease, only of keeping pace with the world that required so much from them. The elderly carried a different burden. Their bodies slowed, their joints stiffened, and their strength faded, but responsibilities lingered long after youth had passed. Older villagers repaired tools, tended fires with careful hands, told stories that preserved memory, and helped raise children so parents could labor in the fields. Their presence offered stability, but it was stability earned through decades of work. Even rest did not come freely. Many slept lightly, waking at the slightest sound, knowing a slipped thatch or dying fire demanded immediate attention. The village needed their wisdom, but wisdom alone did not warm rooms or harvest crops, and so they too pushed through pain, doing what they could with the strength they had left. Then there were those who lived between categories, the forgotten ones, people born with weak limbs or chronic illness, those injured beyond recovery, those whose minds worked differently, leaving them out of sync with the village's strict rhythm. Their lives were shaped by quiet negotiation. Some families protected them fiercely, absorbing their labor, shielding them from judgment. Others struggled, resenting the extra burden, unsure how to divide scarce resources. In a world with no doctors, no social safety nets, and no formal systems of care, these individuals survived through the fragile bonds of community or the persistence of their own will. Yet, even among the forgotten, contributions emerged in subtle forms. Someone unable to walk steadily might weave baskets. Someone unable to lift could mend clothing or tend infants. The medieval world rarely offered choices, but people found ways to stitch themselves into the fabric of daily life, even when the thread they held was thin. Their resilience came not from physical strength, but from the determination to matter, to be useful, to remain part of the world that often overlooked them. Still, the truth lingered beneath every task. Survival favored those who could endure the grind of physical labor. The rest survived through the grace of others, through luck, or through the small pockets of kindness that quietly shaped each village. As we leave this section behind, another question rises into view almost silently. In a life built on constant work and fragile bodies, how did people face the one enemy that shadowed every moment of their existence? Hunger was not a crisis in the medieval world. It was a companion, familiar and persistent, moving quietly beside people from the moment they woke to the moment they lay down again. It threaded itself through the seasons, shaping decisions, routines, and fears in ways that rarely appeared in written histories. Chroniclers spoke of wars and kings, but they rarely mentioned the soft ache in the stomach that most people carried as naturally as their own breath. To understand the medieval world, one must understand that hunger was not a stranger. It was a presence that shaped everything. Food existed, but not in abundance. Meals were built from simple ingredients grown with effort and uncertainty. Grains when the harvest was kind, vegetables when the weather allowed, and bread that was often coarse and dense. Meat was a rare visitor in most homes, appearing only during festivals or when a household animal grew too old to keep. Even then, nothing went to waste. Bones simmered into broth, fat rendered into cooking oil, and organs eaten quickly before they spoiled. Food did not excite or comfort in the way it often does now. It simply kept people alive. The cause of hunger was not neglect but vulnerability. Agriculture demanded predictable weather, and the weather seldom cooperated. A long spring frost, a summer drought, or weeks of heavy rain could mean the difference between a stable winter and a long, uncertain struggle. Fields that fed entire families depended on forces no one could control. People watched the sky with quiet anxiety, knowing a strange cloud or a sudden storm could alter months of work. Their lives moved with the rhythm of seed, soil, and season, and any disruption rippled through the entire community. Daily meals reflected this instability. Breakfast was often nothing more than yesterday's bread dipped in weak ale or water. Lunch might be pottage, a thick stew of grains, greens, and whatever scraps could be added. Each bowl changed from day to day, shaped by what the garden offered or what the household could spare. Dinner was usually another helping of the same, warmed again over the fire. These meals kept people working, but they rarely filled them. A dull ache remained, a reminder that survival was a tightrope walked with steady caution. Children felt hunger most acutely. Their bodies demanded nourishment for growth, yet families had little to give. Parents watched their children eat small portions, pretending not to notice when their own bowls held less. Hunger taught children early to appreciate every crumb, every root, every berry found in the woods. It also taught them humility. They understood that food was precious, earned through labor, and not guaranteed by the passing of a day. Even seasons of plenty held a quiet edge. When harvests were good, people celebrated, storing grain, drying herbs, and filling their cellars. But beneath the joy was the memory of past shortages and the fear of future ones. Food stored in autumn had to last until the following summer. A miscalculation or an infestation of pests could empty a family's reserves months too early. Winter magnified every mistake. Bread loaves grew thinner, stews more watery, and portions more carefully measured. People learned to live on less, and then on even less, tightening their belts, adjusting expectations, and hoping for a kinder spring. Hunger shaped the body, but it also shaped the mind. People learned patience, restraint, and the art of stretching what they had. They knew how to spot edible plants, how to preserve food in simple ways, and how to make a thin stew feel more filling. Hunger taught resourcefulness, but it also brought weariness. Long days of labor demanded energy the body did not always have. Still, people endured, driven by routine and the quiet understanding that there was no alternative. As we leave this section, one question rises naturally. If the stomach was rarely full, how did medieval people manage the fragile journey from field to table, where every step from growth to harvest carried the possibility of loss? The journey from field to table in the medieval world was not as simple as planting a seed and waiting for harvest. It was a delicate chain, held together by weather, luck, and the quiet persistence of people who understood just how easily everything they relied upon could slip away. Each step carried its own uncertainties, and every family felt the weight of them. Hunger might have lived in their stomachs, but fear lived in the fields, whispering reminders that nothing was ever guaranteed. It began with the soil. Before any seed could be sown, the land had to be prepared by hand, guided by tools that were simple and often worn to their limits. People turned the earth with wooden plows, strengthened by iron tips when fortune allowed. The ground resisted, clinging to stones or hardened by winter's grip. Men and women worked side by side, pushing, lifting, and breaking the earth open so it could breathe again. They watched the clouds, the winds, and the early signs of the season, hoping the weather would hold long enough for their efforts to take root. Seeds were precious, saved from the previous year's harvest or traded with neighbors when supplies ran short. Planting them felt like placing hope into the ground. Each seed held the fragile promise of food months away, a promise easily broken. Too much rain could drown the sprouts, too little could leave them brittle and stunted. Storms washed away entire sections of soil, while unexpected frost stole life from tender shoots overnight. People tended their fields with quiet vigilance, scanning for pests, praying for balance, and doing what little they could to protect their future meals. As crops grew, the dangers multiplied. Birds stole grains one peck at a time, mice gnawed through stalks hidden beneath foliage, and insects burrowed into leaves with unsettling precision. Medieval people had no pesticides, no traps beyond what they could craft themselves. Children spent hours walking the borders of fields, clapping wood together to frighten birds away. Adults pulled pests by hand or burned torches at dusk to drive them from the edges of the land. These efforts slowed the damage but never erased it entirely. When harvest season finally approached, the entire village felt the tension. Days were long, sleep short, and hands blistered from cutting and gathering. A sudden storm threatened to ruin months of work, and even a single day's delay could mean losing grain to rot. People moved quickly but carefully, stacking sheaves, hauling bushels, and storing everything with the precision of people who knew mistakes carried serious consequences. The first night after harvest always carried a mixture of relief and caution. Relief that the fields had given something, caution that the coming months would test how far it would stretch. But the chain did not end at harvest. Grain had to be dried, ground, stored, and protected from moisture, insects, and mold. A leaky roof or a poorly sealed container could turn valuable stores into useless rot. Families checked their supplies constantly, knowing that even a small infestation could spread quietly through everything they owned. Bread, porridge, and pottage all depended on these stores surviving the cold months. Every handful mattered. Transporting food added another layer of fragility. Roads were uneven, muddy, and often dangerous, forcing people to carry loads slowly and carefully. A dropped basket, a broken wheel, or a spilled sack carried consequences that echoed far beyond the moment. Even within the village, moving supplies from storage to hearth required caution. The line between having enough and having too little was always thinner than anyone wished to admit. This chain from soil to storage defined survival more deeply than almost anything else. It taught people humility, patience, and a constant awareness of how delicate their world really was. And as we turn toward the next part of their lives, a quieter question emerges. Once food was gathered and stored, how did families decide who ate, how much, and how long the supplies would last? Food in the medieval world did not disappear suddenly. It slipped away quietly, bowl by bowl, until families began to notice the unsettling lightness of their stores. Rationing was not a system written down or agreed upon. It was an instinct, a survival reflex, shaped by generations who understood how swiftly a winter could turn unforgiving. Each household measured its food with careful eyes, adjusting portions based on weather, labor needs, and the subtle fear that the cellar might empty before the fields awakened again. Meals became mathematical without ever feeling like numbers. A mother breaking a loaf of bread did so with practiced restraint, tearing pieces that looked generous enough to comfort her children yet small enough to preserve tomorrow's supply. Fathers ladled stew slowly, making sure each bowl received enough to quiet hunger but not enough to create expectation. Children learned early to eat with patience, savoring each bite as though stretching the moment might somehow stretch the food itself. Hunger did not roar, it whispered, and the whisper was enough to change how people approached every meal. As supplies thinned, creativity took root. Stews grew thinner, filled with more water and fewer ingredients. Bread was bulked with ground oats, dried peas, even ground-up beans when flour ran low. Herbs gathered from the edges of forests found their way into pots, adding flavor where substance could not. Every family developed its own quiet methods of making little feel like enough. Yet even these efforts could not always mask the truth. Some evenings bowls were filled more with hope than nourishment. The emotional weight of shortage lingered beneath the surface. Parents often pretended not to be hungry, claiming they had eaten earlier, or insisting they preferred lighter meals. Their children accepted these explanations, though many sensed the truth in their parents' tired eyes or in the faint rumble of a stomach heard across a quiet room. Meanwhile, the elderly often stepped back from the table, eating only what remained after everyone else finished. They understood that their strength was no longer the village's foundation, the future rested elsewhere, and they made their sacrifices silently. Sharing between families carried its own tension. Some neighbors exchanged small amounts of food, knowing generosity today might mean receiving help tomorrow. Others hesitated, unsure how quickly their own stores would vanish. Every act of kindness came with a calculation, and every refusal left a subtle mark on the village's social fabric. Shortage had a way of sharpening both compassion and suspicion, sometimes within the same household. The darkest part of rationing came when supplies reached their thinnest point. The moment families knew they were entering a dangerous stretch, when every portion felt like a gamble. People counted sacks of grain again and again, hoping to find more than they remembered. They checked for mold, brushed away insects, and whispered small prayers over baskets of dwindling vegetables. Nights grew heavier during these times. Sleep came slowly, and dreams often circled the same quiet dread, the fear of opening the cellar door and finding nothing but empty shelves. And yet, even in these moments, people found ways to endure. They shared stories to distract hungry thoughts, gathered around the hearth to feel warmth instead of fullness, and reminded themselves that their ancestors had survived worse seasons. This fragile resilience carried them forward, day by day, into whatever came next. As we step beyond their tables and cellar doors, another part of their world begins to emerge, one shaped not by hunger alone but by the cold, the darkness, and the untamed elements that surrounded every medieval home. Winter in the medieval world arrived long before the first snow fell. It crept in slowly, carried on a colder wind, sensed in the stiffness of morning soil, and in the way animals grew restless as nights stretched longer. People could feel it in their bones even before the landscape changed. Winter was not simply a season, it was a test, a reminder that survival hinged on preparation, luck, and the fragile balance between warmth and the uncaring cold. The moment the first frost formed on the edges of fields, an unspoken tension settled across villages, urging everyone to move with greater purpose. Inside their homes, warmth never came easily. Fires struggled against the chill that seeped through every crack in the walls, through gaps in wooden boards, and through thatched roofs that sagged under the weight of moisture. Even a well-tended fire produced only a small pocket of heat, forcing families to cluster close together, wrapping themselves in wool blankets that carried the scent of smoke and earth. The air inside often felt as cold as the air outside, only softened slightly by the hearth's glow. Every breath rose visibly in the dim interior, turning into a faint mist before fading into the shadows. Daily tasks became heavier as the cold deepened. Hands numbed quickly, making even simple chores feel like challenges. Water froze in buckets, requiring people to break through thin layers of ice just to wash or cook. Tools stiffened, handles growing brittle, metal becoming painfully cold to touch. Every movement demanded more energy. Even walking across a frost-hardened path required caution, as a moment's slip could lead to injuries that lingered for the rest of winter. People learned to move slowly, as if mindful of the cold watching them, waiting for mistakes. Clothing offered little comfort. Wool garments held in warmth, but only to a degree. Beneath outer layers, people wore linen that rarely felt dry during winter months. Boots absorbed melting snow and thawing mud, leaving feet perpetually damp. Fingers were wrapped in cloth or thin gloves that allowed work but denied true warmth. The cold reached through every barrier, seeping into limbs gradually, settling deep as though claiming territory inch by inch. Nights were the hardest. Families huddled together beneath heavy blankets, using their combined breath and body heat as their strongest defense. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted whenever the fire dipped too low, or when the chill reached through the bedding like an unwelcome guest. Outside, the world transformed into something both quiet and intimidating. Forests stood still, their branches heavy with frost. Rivers slowed, their surfaces glimmering with ice. Fields slept under the pale winter sky, offering nothing but reminders of the work that lay ahead when spring returned. The silence carried an eerie beauty, yet it also carried danger. Traveling became treacherous. Roads grew slick, visibility diminished, and even short journeys risked exposure. People preferred to stay near home, venturing out only when necessity forced their hands. The cold affected moods as much as bodies. Conversations grew shorter, laughter rarer, as people conserved energy. Even animals sensed the weight of winter, their movements slowing, their breaths rising in soft clouds that matched the low, muted light. Food supplies dwindled faster in the cold, making every meal smaller and more precious. Hunger sharpened the edges of each day, merging with the chill to create a quiet anxiety that no fire could fully chase away. Illness found easy shelter during these months. Coughs echoed through homes, lingering in the air like a warning. Fevers rose without clear cause. Joints ached, especially among the elderly, whose bodies struggled against the cold's relentless pressure. With limited remedies available, families relied on rest, warm drinks, and prayers whispered under dim candlelight. The fear of sickness passing from one person to another grew whenever someone faltered. Winter granted little mercy to weakened bodies. Yet despite these hardships, winter also carved moments of fragile beauty. The morning sun cast soft gold across frozen fields. The crunch of snow beneath feet offered a calming rhythm. Frost patterns formed delicate artwork on windows, shimmering like woven lace. Children found small joys in these moments, chasing each other's footprints or sculpting shapes from snow. Even adults paused sometimes, drawn into the quiet, almost sacred stillness that winter spread across the land. Still, beneath every moment lay the truth that winter was a season of endurance. It tested the strength of roofs, the reliability of food stores, the resilience of families. It pushed people to their limits and reminded them of how thin the line was between comfort and hardship. They faced it with caution, humility, and a steady determination shaped by generations before them. Each winter survived became a quiet triumph, woven into memory and passed forward as a sign of strength. And as we turn from the cold exterior world to the darker interior one, a question begins to form gently. If winter pressed so hard from the outside, what fears deepened once the sun dipped below the horizon and the night swallowed the last hints of warmth? Nightfall in the medieval world arrived like a slow, deliberate curtain. When the sun slipped behind the hills, it did not leave behind a gentle dimming, but a plunge into darkness so complete that modern eyes would struggle to imagine it. With no lamps lining streets, no distant glow from cities, no steady hum of electricity, night became a vast and enveloping presence. Shadows didn't merely stretch, they consumed. And as they did, a quiet unease settled over every household, shaping thoughts and movements with a subtle but undeniable pressure. Inside the home, the hearth became the heart of the night. Its flames cast trembling patterns on the walls, illuminating faces in warm flickers, before retreating again into gloom. People positioned themselves near it, instinctively staying close to the one source of light and heat, as though distance carried risk. Beyond the reach of the fire, the room grew murky, shapes blending together, corners thickening with darkness. Even the air felt different still, heavy, attentive. Night had its own presence, its own patience, and its own way of reminding people that the world outside their walls did not sleep as deeply as they hoped. Every sound became more pronounced. The wind scraped against wooden boards, its voice rising and falling like something restless circling the home. Animals shifted in their stalls, hooves thudding softly against the ground or walls. The crackle of burning wood echoed louder, occasionally sending sparks upward in sudden bursts of orange. Families listened with heightened awareness, distinguishing each noise, sensing whether it belonged to something familiar or something unknown. The unknown was what stirred the deeper fear. Stories passed through generations reinforced this unease. In the medieval mind, the darkness was not empty. It held creatures that avoided daylight, spirits wandering fields, thieves waiting for the perfect moment, and animals drawn by the smell of livestock. Even when logic suggested safety, belief whispered otherwise. Legends of beings moving through forests and across moors gained new weight when the night grew thick enough to swallow the edges of sight. Children listened to these tales with wide eyes, yet even adults felt their influence when alone in the dark. Travel at night was rare for good reason. Roads turned perilous in the absence of light, their paths twisting unpredictably between shadows. A misstep could lead to injury, and an injury at night carried greater danger than one in daylight. Travelers who found themselves caught after sunset often sought refuge in barns or roadside chapels, preferring the company of strangers to the open uncertainty of the night. Only emergencies, births, illnesses, or urgent messages pulled people beyond their doorways after dusk. Inside, the darkness influenced behavior. Families gathered close not only for warmth but for comfort. The hearth drew them together physically and emotionally, tightening the boundaries of interaction. Conversations softened, stories lengthened, and silence deepened. People moved with care, mindful of embers, mindful of sleeping children, mindful of the fragile balance between fire and shadow. Candlelight, when available, was used sparingly. A single flame offered limited vision, its glow swallowed quickly by the surrounding blackness. Fear was not constant, but it lingered. It lived in the pauses between sounds, in the moments when the fire sputtered, in the quiet awareness that the night was vast and their homes were small. Some families placed protective charms above doorways or whispered prayers before sleep, believing such gestures created a barrier between themselves and whatever wandered beyond their walls. Whether these beliefs offered real protection or simply comforted weary minds mattered little. In the medieval world, comfort was valuable, even when rooted in superstition. Sleep, when it came, arrived in segments. People rarely slept through the night. Instead, they drifted between rest and wakefulness, rising to tend the fire, check animals, or simply sit near the hearth while the rest of the family slumbered. These moments of solitude heightened awareness. The quiet felt nearly alive. Flames hissed softly. Wood shifted. Something outside might brush against the wall or rustle through nearby brush. The listener's heart would quicken briefly, then settle again with the realization that fear and imagination often intertwined at this hour. Children sometimes woke frightened, confused by dreams shaped by darkness. Parents comforted them with gentle murmurs, pulling them closer beneath blankets. Even adults experienced unsettling dreams in winter, their minds echoing the fears born from cold and uncertainty. Night blurred the line between reality and imagination, making thoughts heavier, more vivid, and sometimes harder to dismiss. Yet nightfall also held its own beauty, quiet and profound. The sky above villages revealed stars in numbers modern eyes rarely see, scattered like distant fires across the blackness. The moon, when full, cast silver paths across frozen fields, creating landscapes that shimmered with eerie stillness. These moments reminded people that darkness was not solely a force of fear but also a space of reflection, of whispered thoughts, of memories carried closer to the surface. Still, as dawn approached, relief washed through the home. The arrival of light felt like a quiet triumph over something ancient and powerful. People stretched stiff limbs, shook off the remnants of uneasy dreams, and prepared once again to face the cold and the day's work. And with night's retreat came another realization. The most dangerous challenges did not always come from the shadows. Many emerged from within, shaped by sickness, fragile bodies, and the delicate balance of health that medieval life demanded. Illness in the medieval world did not always arrive with drama. It came quietly, like a slight chill that refused to leave, a cough that lingered, or a heaviness in the limbs that made each step feel just a little more difficult. People were used to feeling tired. They were used to aches and discomfort. But they also knew, often without being able to explain why, when something was different, when a familiar pain deepened or a simple weakness began to thicken into something more ominous. A quiet tension spread through the household. Life hinged on strength, and when strength faltered, every part of daily existence trembled with it. A mild fever might begin on an ordinary evening. Someone would sit a little closer to the fire than usual, shivering despite the flames. Their skin would feel warm to the touch, yet they would complain of being cold. In homes without thermometers, without charts or medical terms, families relied on instinct, touch, and observation. They felt foreheads, watched how quickly someone breathed, noted how often a person coughed. Small changes became important clues. A lost appetite, restless sleep, or a sudden quietness in an otherwise talkative child could all signal the start of an illness. No symptom was small when the stakes were so high. Sickness meant more than discomfort. It meant the possibility of falling behind in the endless tasks that sustained the house. If a parent grew ill, fields might go untended, wood uncut, or animals neglected. If a child weakened, someone else had to stay close, losing hours of work in the process. Every illness, however minor it appeared, stretched the household thin. People understood this instinctively. They measured the severity of sickness not only by pain, but by how much it threatened the fragile balance of their daily survival. A lingering cough during winter, when air was already thick with smoke and dampness, felt particularly dangerous. There were few ways to fight back. Cleanliness, in the modern sense, was limited. Water was heavy to carry and difficult to heat. Washing clothes and bedding took time and effort that many households could barely spare. People did what they could, airing linens in the sun, sweeping floors, changing straw when insects grew too numerous. They did not know about germs, but they learned through experience which conditions seemed to worsen sickness and which seemed to ease it. Fresh air, when weather allowed, was valued. So was warmth, though achieving it required constant feeding of the fire. When illness deepened, families turned to what remedies they had. Herbs were gathered from gardens or the edges of fields. Mint for the stomach, thyme for the chest, chamomile for restless sleep. Honey soothed sore throats when available. Broths were prepared from whatever scraps could be spared, offered gently to lips that no longer craved food. These efforts carried as much hope as they did healing. People wanted to believe that something could be done, that they were not entirely helpless against the invisible forces at work inside the body. Often, they watched for signs that their small actions were having an effect: a quieter breathing pattern, a steadier gaze, a little more color in pale cheeks. Yet many times, improvement did not come. Fever burned on through the night, coughs grew harsher, the sick person's world shrank to the space around their bed or the corner near the hearth, where they lay wrapped in rough blankets. Sounds of daily life continued around them: the scrape of chairs, the murmur of voices, the crackle of wood on the fire. Life could not pause entirely, even when someone hovered between recovery and decline. That reality weighed heavily on the minds of those who sat at a bedside, and then rose to tend animals or fetch water, torn between care and obligation. Fear of contagion lingered, even if the word itself was unknown. Families noticed when illness spread from one person to another, and they learned to dread the first sign that someone new had begun to cough. Parents watched their children closely, anxious whenever one seemed less energetic than usual. They also watched each other, silently aware that losing an adult to sickness could reshape the entire future of the household. Death did not always come with fanfare. Sometimes it arrived after days or weeks of slow weakening, a gradual slipping away that everyone saw and no one could stop. Still, there were recoveries. There were mornings when a fever finally broke, leaving the patient drenched in sweat but breathing more evenly. There were days when someone stood up after long weakness, legs trembling yet determined. These moments felt almost miraculous, not because anyone believed they understood the cause, but because survival itself felt like a gift that could never be taken for granted. People remembered such recoveries for years, speaking of them in quiet tones, as if afraid to anger the unseen forces that allowed them. Illness, then, was not an interruption of normal life. It was woven into it, a constant possibility hovering at the edges of every season and every task. Medieval people lived with that awareness in a way that is difficult to imagine now. They knew each cough, each chill, each flare of pain might be the beginning of a new test, not just for one body but for the entire household. And when those tests grew too heavy, they turned not only to herbs and rest, but to the figures who claimed to hold deeper knowledge, those healers, midwives, and learned men who stood at the uncertain border between hope and resignation. Some were trusted, others feared, and many stood somewhere in between, spoken of in whispers when candles burned low. To call upon them was to admit that ordinary efforts had failed. It meant opening one's door not to a person, but to secrets, to uncertainty, and to the possibility of a cure that might cost more than expected. When an illness deepened beyond what a family could manage alone, attention turned to the people who lived between the worlds of knowledge and uncertainty, the healers. They were not physicians in the modern sense, nor were they figures of pure superstition. They occupied a space shaped by experience, intuition, and traditions older than memory. Some were respected, others regarded with caution, yet all carried an air of mystery. Their presence stirred quiet hope, but also the uneasy awareness that the line between remedy and risk was far thinner than most dared to admit. Many healers learned their skills through generations of careful observation. They knew which herbs eased pain, which cleared congestion, which eased a troubled stomach, and which brought sleep. They could read a fever in the color of a person's skin, sense the seriousness of a cough by its depth, or guess the nature of a sickness by the sharpness of its decline. Their homes often smelled of dried plants and smoke, the air thick with the scent of lavender, rosemary, or crushed leaves hanging from the rafters. Visitors stepped inside with a mixture of relief and apprehension, aware that these spaces were built for healing but touched by forces they barely understood. Herbal remedies lay at the heart of their work. A healer might grind roots into powders, boil leaves into teas, or create salves from fat mixed with infused oils. They spoke softly while preparing these mixtures, explaining little but observing much. They watched how a patient drank, how they breathed, how their hands trembled or steadied. Their treatments varied from mild to intense, depending on what they believed the body required. Some remedies soothed, easing discomfort and calming nerves. Others shocked the system, provoking sweat or purging what healers thought needed to be expelled. Whether these methods worked depended as much on the sickness as on faith. Midwives held their own place in the healing world. They guided births, tended women's ailments, and understood the fragile moments when life entered or left a body. Their knowledge was indispensable, yet they too walked a narrow path. A successful birth brought gratitude, but tragedy brought suspicion. People wanted explanations for suffering, and midwives often bore the weight of fears they did not create. Even so, their work saved countless lives, their hands steady in moments shaped by both hope and danger. More formal medical practitioners existed, though they were rare outside towns. These men often trained through books and lectures rather than practical experience, followed beliefs rooted in ancient theories. They spoke of humors, of imbalances between bodily fluids, and of treatments that aimed to restore harmony. Their methods included bloodletting, purging, and prescribing mixtures that tasted as strange as their descriptions. For families unfamiliar with such practices, these physicians seemed both impressive and unsettling. Their presence implied knowledge, yet their results were unpredictable. Some patients improved, others did not. Illness did not always bow to learning. Superstition often intertwined with healing. People believed that certain amulets protected against sickness, that specific prayers helped fevers break, or that herbs placed above doorways kept harmful forces away. Healers rarely dismissed these beliefs. They understood that hope was a form of medicine, that the mind could shape recovery as surely as a poultice or brew. In moments of deeper fear, people turned to charms, whispered incantations, or sought blessings from local holy figures. Healing, for them, was not merely physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and deeply personal. Yet healers also carried a darker reputation. Their knowledge set them apart, and anything that set someone apart in a small village could spark unease. People whispered if a healer seemed too skilled, too secretive, or too familiar with illnesses others did not understand. They wondered where knowledge came from, and whether some remedies crossed lines that should not be crossed. A recovery could be seen as proof of skill. A death could cast doubt on everything a healer had done. Their work carried a burden: praise when fortune smiled, suspicion when it turned away. Despite this tension, families sought help when they had no other choice. They walked through forests to reach a healer's hut, or invited one into their home with mixed feelings. The healer's arrival often changed the atmosphere. They brought with them not only herbs but an understanding of the body that felt almost uncanny. Their presence reminded everyone that sickness was not merely a physical battle, it was a crossing into the unknown, where experience mattered but certainty vanished. Healers did what they could, but their limitations were undeniable. Some illnesses yielded to their care, others resisted, deepening despite every remedy. Families waited through long nights, listening to the breaths of the sick, hoping for small improvements. The healer returned repeatedly, adjusting treatments, offering reassurance, or preparing families for the possibility that recovery might not come. These moments revealed the truth at the core of medieval medicine. Healing was as much about endurance as intervention. When someone survived, gratitude flowed freely. People remembered the healer's visits, the warmth of a herbal tea, the moment a fever broke. They spoke of these recoveries with reverence, treating each one as a quiet miracle. But when someone did not survive, the healer left quietly, carrying the weight of failure in silence. The family, too, carried something, an awareness of how thin the line was between life and loss. And from this fragile world of healing, another thread begins to emerge. How did communities hold together through these hardships? What unspoken rules shaped their support, their suspicions, and the quiet cooperation that allowed them to survive together? A medieval village was more than a cluster of homes and fields. It was a living web of expectations, habits, and quiet agreements. People rarely spoke of these rules, yet they felt them in every conversation, every exchanged glance, every task shared between neighbors. Life depended on cooperation far more than on written law, and so the village developed its own silent code, one shaped by survival, trust, and the delicate balance between belonging and isolation. For those who understood these rules, daily life flowed smoothly. For those who didn't, the world could become colder than winter itself. Most villagers grew up learning these expectations without realizing they were learning anything at all. They observed how adults spoke to one another, how disputes were softened through careful phrasing, and how praise was offered sparingly but meaningfully. A compliment from a neighbor carried more weight than any official decree, because it confirmed something crucial: acceptance. Belonging was not a simple matter of birthplace. It was earned through participation, through being present in the rhythms of the village, helping repair a fence, sharing news about weather patterns, or offering a tool when someone's had broken. Reputation formed the backbone of village life. A person's worth was measured not by wealth but by reliability. Even small acts shaped how others viewed you. If someone fetched water for an elderly neighbor without being asked, people noticed. If another borrowed a tool and returned it dull or damaged, people noticed that too. Villagers remembered everything, not out of malice but necessity. In a place where survival depended on cooperation, knowing who could be trusted mattered as much as knowing when the first frost would fall. Conversations carried layers beneath their surface. A simple greeting might hide a question, a joke might carry a warning, and a silence might speak louder than words. The tone of a meeting mattered as much as its content. If someone avoided eye contact, others wondered why. If two families shared fewer words than usual, whispers drifted quietly through the village, trying to make sense of the change. Rumors were rarely shouted. They spread slowly, traveling on lowered voices at the well or murmured over bread in dim kitchens. No one declared themselves a keeper of the village's memory, yet somehow everyone contributed a piece. Conflict existed, though rarely erupted openly. Most disputes simmered beneath polite exchanges, resolved through subtle gestures rather than confrontation. A boundary disagreement between farms might be settled with a shared meal, each family offering just enough courtesy to smooth the edge of resentment. If a neighbor felt offended, they might withhold small favors for a time, declining to share grain or hesitating to help repair a broken roof. These signals, though soft, were clear to anyone paying attention. Life required harmony, or at least the appearance of it, and so people learned to navigate disagreements like travelers crossing thin ice. The church played a quiet but constant role in shaping these dynamics. Its bell marked the passage of time and anchored the community in shared rituals. Though faith offered comfort, it also reinforced expectations: generosity, humility, restraint. Villagers listened closely to sermons, not only for spiritual guidance but for hints about how to remain in good standing with their neighbors. Morality was not merely personal, it was communal. A person who ignored the needs of others found themselves whispered about in ways that could change their entire future. Even celebrations revealed the village's unwritten rules. Feast days brought warmth, music, shared food, and brief moments of joy that contrasted with the hardships of the year. But beneath the laughter, people watched each other carefully. Who brought what to the table? Who arrived with a cheerful spirit? And who sat quietly in the corner? These gatherings reinforced bonds or exposed cracks. They reminded everyone that togetherness was not simply tradition, it was survival. Children sensed these rules long before they could articulate them. They learned to greet elders respectfully, to listen more than they spoke, to observe how adults handled delicate moments. By the time they reached adolescence, these unspoken codes were woven into their identities. Straying from them meant risking solitude, a danger far greater than hunger. A family viewed as unreliable might struggle to find help during emergencies. A person known for sharp words or careless actions might be met with cold courtesy rather than genuine support. Still, the village was not purely governed by suspicion. There was a gentler side to these rules, one built on the knowledge that everyone faced the same challenges. When illness struck a household, neighbors stepped forward quietly, offering bread, tending fields, or watching children. When tragedy fell, families surrounded the grieving, not with dramatic displays but with steady presence. These gestures were never seen as extraordinary. They were simply part of the web, a web that held even when threads frayed. Belonging offered more than comfort. It offered protection. A person accepted by the village walked through life knowing that if their roof collapsed, someone would help rebuild it. If a child wandered too far into the woods, others would join the search. If someone fell behind during harvest, extra hands would appear in the fields at dawn. These gestures created a sense of safety deeper than any physical defense. Yet this same web that supported could also entangle. Those who failed to meet expectations could feel its weight turn against them. A missed greeting could be interpreted as disrespect. A forgotten debt could grow into suspicion. Gradually, someone might find themselves on the edges of the community's regard, not shunned but no longer held close. And once someone slipped from the center to the margins, returning grew difficult. Distance invited whispers, and whispers invited doubt. It is here, in these soft boundaries between acceptance and exclusion, that another layer of the medieval world emerges. The lives of those who did not fully belong, those who drifted at the edge of trust. To understand them is to understand another hidden truth of the past, one that reveals how fragile the comfort of community truly was. Every medieval village had its center, where voices blended easily, where people recognized one another's footsteps, and where daily life unfolded in familiar patterns. But beyond that center, at the edges of comfort and belonging, lived another set of individuals, those who did not fully fit, who drifted between acceptance and suspicion. They were not always feared, nor always pitied, but they carried an atmosphere that set them apart, a quiet distance that deepened with each season. Their presence revealed the delicate balance within the village, showing how closely survival was tied not only to labor but to reputation and perception. Some outsiders were wanderers, people who rarely remained in one place. They arrived with little more than worn cloaks, patched shoes, and stories shaped by hardship. Travelers were not uncommon, yet they were met with cautious eyes. People wondered where they had come from, what troubles they carried, and whether they sought refuge or opportunity. A weary traveler might be offered a bowl of pottage or a place near the hearth for one night, but rarely more. Hospitality existed, but so did fear. Outsiders lived with the knowledge that kindness could fade quickly if misfortune followed them into the village. Others were locals who had slipped from the center of community life through no fault of their own. A man injured in an accident might no longer contribute as he once did. A woman who lost her family might withdraw from gatherings, her grief reshaping how others viewed her. Illness, misfortune, or simple difference could slowly shift someone from belonging to drifting. The transformation happened quietly, without announcement. One day a person was greeted with warmth, the next, with polite distance. The villagers seldom intended harm. They simply protected what felt familiar and predictable, leaving those who struggled to navigate life from a colder, more fragile place. Then there were those whose manner or mind set them apart. A person who spoke softly to themselves, who stared at the sky too long, or who moved with unexpected gestures might become a subject of whispered concern. Medieval people lived close to mystery, but they also feared what they could not explain. Some believed such individuals carried strange insights. Others believed they carried misfortune. These people rarely faced open hostility, but their lives unfolded beneath a shadow of uncertainty. Children were warned not to wander too close, and adults offered assistance only when necessary, never lingering long. Begging existed at the edge of every settlement. Those with no family, no land, and no means survived by relying on the charity of others. Medieval villagers understood poverty intimately, but they still guarded their resources fiercely. A beggar might receive a crust of bread or a ladle of stew, but seldom enough to ease hunger fully. People gave what they could spare without risking their own survival. As a result, beggars lived in a constant tension, grateful for kindness, but frightened of days when charity dwindled. They slept near barns, chapels, or in abandoned huts that barely held out the wind. Suspicion grew deepest when misfortune struck the village: failed crops, unexpected illness, unexplained accidents. In those moments, eyes turned toward the fringes. People wondered, quietly at first, whether someone had brought misfortune with them, or allowed some unseen force to follow. Medieval belief blurred the line between the physical and the spiritual. Misfits, wanderers, or simply unlucky individuals found themselves at the center of quiet speculation. No accusation was spoken aloud, yet the unease lingered. It hung in the air like smoke, subtle but persistent. Despite these challenges, Outsiders were not without their own strengths. Many possessed skills, others lacked knowledge of distant places, herbal remedies learned on the road, or hands skilled in crafts the village rarely encountered. Some were excellent storytellers, weaving tales so captivating that people leaned closer despite themselves. Others were skilled hunters, able to track game where villagers failed. Their abilities created moments of connection, reminders that difference did not always mean danger, yet the connection rarely lasted. Once the moment passed, distance returned like a habit. Some outsiders found small anchors. A widow might take in a wandering child. A blacksmith might offer odd jobs to a man with steady hands. A healer might see value in a mind that noticed strange patterns in plants or weather. These connections provided a fragile safety net, thin but meaningful. They allowed outsiders a place to sit, a task to perform, or a meal to share without feeling entirely apart. But even these ties were delicate. One misstep, a broken promise, a misunderstood gesture, a poorly timed misfortune could undo months of quiet trust. Yet it was often the outsiders who noticed what others overlooked. They lived at the margins, and from those margins they saw the village from a different angle. They sensed tension before it rose to the surface, felt shifts in mood before others acknowledged them. Their distance granted perspective, though not comfort. They observed the ways people clung to routine, how fear shaped decisions, how scarcity made even kindness feel conditional. They understood the village's strengths and its fragility in equal measure. Still, isolation weighed heavily. Nights were colder when spent alone. Meals thinner when begging was all one could rely upon. Outsiders walked a path shaped by silence, their footsteps echoing along the edges of fields or through the narrow lanes that led away from the village. Their existence served as a quiet warning to others, a reminder that belonging was a fragile gift, easily lost and rarely regained. And as we shift deeper into the hidden emotional world of medieval life, another question begins to rise gently from the shadows. What lived inside the hearts of these people, those who belonged and those who did not, when love, fear, faith, and uncertainty shaped their innermost thoughts?
A medieval village was more than a cluster of homes and fields. It was a living web of expectations, habits, and quiet agreements. People rarely spoke of these rules, yet they felt them in every conversation, every exchanged glance, every task shared between neighbors. Life depended on cooperation far more than on written law, and so the village developed its own silent code, one shaped by survival, trust, and the delicate balance between belonging and isolation. For those who understood these rules, daily life flowed smoothly. For those who didn't, the world could become colder than winter itself. Most villagers grew up learning these expectations without realizing they were learning anything at all. They observed how adults spoke to one another, how disputes were softened through careful phrasing, and how praise was offered sparingly but meaningfully. A compliment from a neighbor carried more weight than any official decree because it confirmed something crucial: acceptance. Belonging was not a simple matter of birthplace. It was earned through participation, through being present in the rhythms of the village, helping repair a fence, sharing news about weather patterns, or offering a tool when someone's had broken. Reputation formed the backbone of village life. A person's worth was measured not by wealth, but by reliability. Even small acts shaped how others viewed you. If someone fetched water for an elderly neighbor without being asked, people noticed. If another borrowed a tool and returned it dull or damaged, people noticed that too. Villagers remembered everything, not out of malice, but necessity. In a place where survival depended on cooperation, knowing who could be trusted mattered as much as knowing when the first frost would fall. Conversations carried layers beneath their surface. A simple greeting might hide a question, a joke might carry a warning, and a silence might speak louder than words. The tone of a meeting mattered as much as its content. If someone avoided eye contact, others wondered why. If two families shared fewer words than usual, whispers drifted quietly through the village, trying to make sense of the change. Rumors were rarely shouted. They spread slowly, traveling on lowered voices at the well or murmured over bread in dim kitchens. No one declared themselves a keeper of the village's memory, yet somehow everyone contributed a piece. Conflict existed, though rarely erupted openly. Most disputes simmered beneath polite exchanges, resolved through subtle gestures rather than confrontation. A boundary disagreement between farms might be settled with a shared meal, each family offering just enough courtesy to smooth the edge of resentment. If a neighbor felt offended, they might withhold small favors for a time, declining to share grain or hesitating to help repair a broken roof. These signals, though soft, were clear to anyone paying attention. Life required harmony, or at least the appearance of it, and so people learned to navigate disagreements like travelers crossing thin ice. The church played a quiet but constant role in shaping these dynamics. Its bell marked the passage of time and anchored the community in shared rituals. Though faith offered comfort, it also reinforced expectations, generosity, humility, restraint. Villagers listened closely to sermons, not only for spiritual guidance, but for hints about how to remain in good standing with their neighbors. Morality was not merely personal, it was communal. A person who ignored the needs of others found themselves whispered about in ways that could change their entire future. Even celebrations revealed the village's unwritten rules. Feast days brought warmth, music, shared food, and brief moments of joy that contrasted with the hardships of the year. But beneath the laughter, people watched each other carefully. Who brought what to the table? Who arrived with a cheerful spirit and who sat quietly in the corner? These gatherings reinforced bonds or exposed cracks. They reminded everyone that togetherness was not simply tradition, it was survival. Children sensed these rules long before they could articulate them. They learned to greet elders respectfully, to listen more than they spoke, to observe how adults handled delicate moments. By the time they reached adolescence, these unspoken codes were woven into their identities. Straying from them meant risking solitude, a danger far greater than hunger. A family viewed as unreliable might struggle to find help during emergencies. A person known for sharp words or careless actions might be met with cold courtesy rather than genuine support. Still, the village was not purely governed by suspicion. There was a gentler side to these rules, one built on the knowledge that everyone faced the same challenges. When illness struck a household, neighbors stepped forward quietly, offering bread, tending fields, or watching children. When tragedy fell, families surrounded the grieving not with dramatic displays, but with steady presence. These gestures were never seen as extraordinary. They were simply part of the web, a web that held, even when threads frayed. Belonging offered more than comfort. It offered protection. A person accepted by the village walked through life knowing that if their roof collapsed, someone would help rebuild it. If a child wandered too far into the woods, others would join the search. If someone fell behind during harvest, extra hands would appear in the fields at dawn. These gestures created a sense of safety deeper than any physical defense. Yet this same web that supported could also entangle. Those who failed to meet the expectations could feel its weight turn against them. A missed greeting could be interpreted as disrespect. A forgotten debt could grow into suspicion. Gradually, someone might find themselves on the edges of the community's regard, not shunned, but no longer held close. And once someone slipped from the center to the margins, returning grew difficult. Distance invited whispers, and whispers invited doubt. It is here, in these soft boundaries between acceptance and exclusion, that another layer of the medieval world emerges, the lives of those who did not fully belong, those who drifted at the edge of trust. To understand them is to understand another hidden truth of the past, one that reveals how fragile the comfort of community truly was. Every medieval village had its center, where voices blended easily, where people recognized each other's footsteps, and where daily life unfolded in familiar patterns. But beyond that center, at the edges of comfort and belonging, lived another set of individuals, those who didn't fully fit, who drifted between acceptance and suspicion. They were not always feared, nor always pitied, but they carried an atmosphere that set them apart, a quiet distance that deepened with each season. Their presence revealed the delicate balance within the village, showing how closely survival was tied not only to labor, but to reputation and perception. Some outsiders were wanderers, people who rarely remained in one place. They arrived with little more than worn cloaks, patched shoes, and stories shaped by hardship. Travelers were not uncommon, but they were met with cautious eyes. People wondered where they had come from, what troubles they carried, and whether they sought refuge or opportunity. A weary traveler might be offered a bowl of pottage or a place near the hearth for one night, but not more. Hospitality existed, but so did fear. Outsiders lived with the knowledge that kindness could fade quickly if misfortune followed them into the village. Others were locals who had slipped from the center of community life for no fault of their own. A man injured in an accident might no longer contribute as he once did. A woman who lost her family might withdraw from gatherings, her grief reshaping how others viewed her. Illness, misfortune, or simple difference could slowly shift someone from belonging to drifting. The transformation happened quietly, without announcement. One day a person was greeted with warmth, the next with polite distance. The villagers seldom intended harm, they simply protected what felt familiar and predictable, leaving those who struggled to navigate life from a colder, more fragile place. Then there were those whose manner or mind set them apart. A person who spoke softly to themselves, who stared at the sky too long, or who moved with unexpected gestures, might become a subject of whispered concern. Medieval people lived close to mystery, but they also feared what they could not explain. Some believed such individuals carried strange insights. Others believed they carried misfortune. These people rarely faced open hostility, but their lives unfolded beneath the shadow of Childhood in the medieval world unfolded quietly, shaped not by play or leisure, but by the soft weight of expectation that settled on children almost from the moment they learned to walk. There was no clear boundary marking where infancy ended and responsibility began. Instead, duty crept into their lives the way dawn crept across the fields, slowly, steadily, and without anyone needing to point it out. The world around them showed what mattered, and they absorbed those lessons long before they could articulate them. It was not harshness that hurried them forward, but necessity, woven into the rhythm of every day. A child's earliest memories often began with watching adults work. They observed the way their parents' hands moved through soil, how they tended animals, how they carried burdens from one task to the next. These movements became a language long before children learned to speak fully. They understood, in a way only the very young can, that these actions kept the household alive. So when someone placed a small bundle of sticks in their arms or handed them a basket to carry, it felt natural. They were simply joining the flow of life that pulsed around them. Their first tasks were modest, scaring birds from crops, fetching water in tiny clay cups, gathering herbs near the edge of fields. Yet even these small chores carried meaning. A child chasing birds away understood, without needing to be told, that a moment's inattention could cost the family part of its harvest. A child gathering herbs knew each leaf mattered. Purpose became part of their identity early, shaping the way they saw themselves within the family. Childhood was not a space separate from adulthood, but a slow merging into it. Play existed, but it did not dominate their days. It slipped in between chores, in stolen moments when the sun hung high and work paused briefly. Children played with carved wooden figures, stones, bits of cloth, or whatever the land offered. Their games mirrored the world around them, pretending to farm, pretending to cook, pretending to herd animals. Even in play, they practiced becoming who they were expected to be. Their laughter rose between tasks like birdsong, brief and bright, then faded back into the rhythm of responsibility. Despite early labor, children were not unloved. Care expressed itself through action rather than words. A mother might wrap extra cloth around a child before sending them outside. A father might carve a toy at the end of a long day, his rough hands shaping something soft enough for small fingers. Families watched over their young even when speaking little. They taught through demonstration, guiding gently, correcting quietly, and allowing children to feel pride when they accomplished tasks that once seemed too heavy. Still, life offered little shelter from the harsher realities of the world. Illness struck children frequently, their bodies fragile against cold winds, damp floors, and long winters. A fever could turn a bright-eyed child quiet within hours. Families fought fiercely to protect their young, but often with limited means. Herbs, broths, prayers whispered through sleepless nights. Many children survived, many did not. Those who reached adolescence carried the weight of the ones who hadn't, though they seldom spoke of it. Survival shaped them before grief could fully register. Education, for most, did not come from books. It came from imitation, repetition, and consequences. Children learned to read the behavior of animals, the mood of the sky, the texture of soil. They learned which plants nourished and which harmed. They learned how to listen for danger in the quiet moments, how to interpret the shifting tones of their parents' voices, and how to stand silently when elders spoke. Knowledge accumulated in layers, each season adding to what they already understood. Schooling was rare, reserved for a privileged few, but wisdom was everywhere, embedded in daily tasks. Older children gradually took on heavier responsibilities. A girl might learn to spin wool, weave cloth, or prepare meals. A boy might accompany his father to fields or forests, carrying tools and watching closely. They grew into their roles with a mixture of pride and fatigue. By the time they reached adolescence, they were no longer considered children at all. Their hands bore calluses, their shoulders carried weight, and their eyes held an awareness shaped by years of steady work. They had already lived through enough changes of season to understand that life did not slow for anyone. Yet within this demanding world, childhood still contained moments of wonder. Children found beauty in simple things, a bird's feather caught in grass, sunlight flickering on water, the first green shoots of spring. They listened to stories by the hearth, tales of saints, spirits, and distant lands. These stories carried them briefly beyond their small village, giving them glimpses of mystery that lingered in their thoughts long after the fire died down. Their imaginations threaded themselves into the world around them, offering private sanctuary even when days grew long. The emotional life of medieval children was shaped not only by hardship, but by connection.
They formed bonds with siblings, shared whispers in darkened rooms, and clung to each other during storms. Friendships emerged through shared chores, small discoveries, or mutual curiosity about the world beyond the village boundaries. These bonds softened the edges of responsibility, reminding them that even though life demanded much, they were not alone in what it asked. As we move forward, the next chapters reveal another side of the medieval journey, the far edge of life, where age brought wisdom but also weariness, and where survival demanded a different kind of strength. Childhood shaped people through expectation. Old age shaped them through endurance. Old age in the medieval world was not a gentle drifting into quiet comforts, but a gradual surrender to a body worn down by years of labor. It was a time shaped by memory, by endurance, and by a slow recognition that strength was no longer something one could summon on command. Elders did not retire from the world around them. Instead, they moved through it more slowly, carrying the weight of decades in their bones. Their steps shortened, their breath came quicker, and yet they continued, not because they wished to, but because life left little room for stepping aside. The signs of aging emerged early: a stiff back after a day in the fields, knees that cracked with each bend, eyes that strained to see by firelight, hands that trembled when thread needed to be guided or tools needed to be sharpened. These changes did not arrive suddenly, but edged quietly into daily life, barely noticeable at first. Eventually, they became constant companions. Elders learned to adapt, adjusting tasks to match what their bodies could still manage. They rose earlier, moved more deliberately, and accepted that chores, once done quickly, now required time and care. Despite their slowing pace, elders remained vital to the household. Their roles shifted from physical labor to guidance, storytelling, and careful observation. They noticed changes in the weather long before others did. They remembered the patterns of past seasons, the years when frost came early or rains arrived too late. Their knowledge, gathered slowly across a lifetime, served as an anchor for the younger generations navigating uncertainty. Wisdom became their new form of strength, subtle but invaluable. Households leaned heavily on this wisdom. Elders taught children how to read the land, how to mend clothing, how to prepare herbs for healing, and how to interpret the moods of animals. Their voices carried authority not through volume, but through experience. A simple comment from an elder could settle a dispute, calm a worried parent, or guide a decision about planting or harvesting. Even when their bodies weakened, their presence held quiet power. In a world where knowledge was rarely written, their memories were the closest thing a village had to an archive. Yet old age brought burdens. Pain was constant, settling into joints and muscles like cold that never fully left. Sleep became lighter, interrupted by aches or by the restlessness of thoughts that drifted through long hours of darkness. Many elders lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the breathing of their family, the crackle of the fire, the shifting of animals nearby. Those small noises would one day continue without them. That awareness shaped their thoughts, creating moments of reflection that no one else witnessed. Emotions deepened with age, though often expressed quietly. Elders felt pride when watching a grandchild complete a difficult task, sorrow when memories of lost loved ones resurfaced unexpectedly, and gratitude for small comforts: a warm place near the hearth, a bowl of broth prepared with care, or a familiar song hummed softly during work. Their inner worlds grew rich, even as their bodies grew frail. They carried stories not only of events, but of feelings, of fears survived, of joys remembered, of choices made when they were young and strong. Dependence crept in slowly. An elder who once carried heavy loads now relied on a child to fetch water. Someone who once walked miles each day now appreciated a steady arm for even the shortest trip outside. This shift in roles was not always easy. Some accepted it with grace, others with quiet frustration. Losing independence felt like losing pieces of oneself, and yet the family's support softened the transition. The respect shown by younger generations mattered deeply, offering dignity where physical strength had faded. Not all elders experienced such tenderness. Some lived alone after losing their families. Others became a burden to households already stretched thin. Resources were scarce, and caring for someone who could no longer contribute physically placed pressure on families fighting to survive. These elders often lived in the quietest corners of villages, visited occasionally, surviving through a combination of charity, resilience, and the endurance shaped by a lifetime of hardship. Their eyes carried stories that no one asked to hear, and their presence reminded everyone of the path awaiting them. And yet, in many ways, elders formed the emotional heart of the community. Their blessings were sought at weddings, their comfort at funerals. Their words soothed disputes and strengthened hope. People recognized that time had carved something into them, an understanding of life that could not be rushed or replicated. Even in their frailty, they held a kind of power rooted not in force, but in perspective. As the years drew on, elders prepared themselves for the inevitable. Death was not feared in the way it is today. It was seen as a return to the mystery that shaped all things. Many spent their final months near the hearth, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by familiar voices. They watched the next generation take on tasks they once mastered, and felt a quiet acceptance. Their lives had followed the same path: childhood filled with chores, adulthood marked by labor, parenthood shaped by responsibility, and old age softened by reflection. When they finally slipped away, the village felt the loss deeply. There was no recorded history to mark their passing, no written biography. Yet their impact lingered in the habits of their families, in the knowledge they had passed on, in the stories that continued to be told long after their final breath. They became part of the land, part of the memory of the community, part of the rhythm that bound generations together. And as we leave this stage of life behind, another question begins to arise. What meaning did people find in a world shaped by constant struggle, where each stage of life carried weight, and where existence itself demanded understanding beyond mere survival?
Acceptance in the medieval world was not a philosophy crafted through study or reflection. It was something shaped by circumstance, learned not through choice, but through the simple fact that life rarely allowed alternatives. People lived with a deep awareness of limits of the body, the land, the seasons, and their own place within the fragile structure of their community. They understood that much of what happened around them could not be controlled, and so they adapted with a quiet strength that rarely appears in written chronicles. Acceptance was not resignation. It was a way of recognizing reality and walking forward anyway, step by steady step. This kind of acceptance began early in life. Children learned that certain hardships could not be avoided, only endured. They watched as their parents worked through exhaustion, as fields flooded or froze, and as sickness moved through the village without warning. They saw that frustration changed nothing, and that anger offered no protection. Over time, they absorbed the lesson. Survival demanded patience. Not a passive patience, but a practical one that allowed them to keep going even when circumstances felt heavy or unfair. Acceptance was stitched into their worldview slowly, the way a seamstress adds thread to cloth, almost without notice, until the pattern becomes clear. Adults carried this understanding in their posture, in the way they approached each day. They did not expect ease. They did not imagine futures shaped by personal ambition or dramatic change. Their hopes were smaller, but no less meaningful. A steady harvest, a healthy child, a winter that could be endured without losing too much. Dreams existed, but they settled themselves within the boundaries of what felt possible. The medieval mind lived closer to the earth, closer to necessity, and closer to forces that shifted with little warning. People accepted that the world was larger and more unpredictable than they were. Acceptance shaped relationships as well. Disagreements surfaced, but they were often settled through compromise rather than confrontation. People knew that holding grudges drained energy they needed elsewhere. A conflict with a neighbor could make a winter far colder, so they learned to soften their tone, to let certain arguments fade, to forgive quickly, even when forgiveness felt undeserved. This did not mean tensions vanished, they simply settled beneath the surface, managed through habits of restraint. People accepted that harmony was less about emotion and more about survival. Hardship, too, found its place within this practice of acceptance. When crops failed or animals died, grief mingled with a kind of steadiness. People mourned privately, sometimes deeply, but they also prepared themselves to rebuild. They had learned that hardship visited every household sooner or later. No family was immune, and no person could outrun the weight of circumstances. Acceptance did not dull pain, but it gave people the strength to move through it. They understood that life did not pause for sorrow, so they carried their grief while continuing to work, quietly weaving loss into the fabric of their days. The landscape itself reinforced this mindset. Seasons changed with an authority that humbled even the strongest. Winter arrived on its own terms. Spring began only when the earth allowed, and storms paid no mind to human need. People accepted these rhythms because resisting them was impossible. Instead, they adjusted their expectations and shaped their routines around the natural world. Acceptance became a way of aligning themselves with the land rather than fighting against it. They read the sky like a familiar script, trusting its warnings even when they brought unwelcome news. Spiritual beliefs deepened this sense of acceptance. Faith taught that suffering had meaning, that trials served a purpose, and that patience was a form of virtue. People prayed not only for change, but for endurance, trusting that some unseen wisdom guided their lives. Whether or not those beliefs were justified mattered less than the comfort they offered. Faith allowed acceptance to soften into something almost peaceful, giving people a way to surrender their worries without feeling defeated. In this way, acceptance became a shared language between the physical world and the spiritual one. As people aged, acceptance grew quieter but more profound. Elders looked back on their lives with a mixture of pride and resignation. They remembered times of hardship, moments of joy, and the countless small decisions that shaped their paths. Many realized that the world had never promised fairness, only opportunity. Their acceptance came from understanding that survival itself was a kind of success. They no longer longed for what might have been. Instead, they focused on the present, the warmth of the hearth, the company of family, the familiar sounds of the village moving through another day. Acceptance also brought a subtle kind of wisdom. Those who embraced it learned to see what others overlooked, the small signs that foretold change, the shifting moods in a household, the fragile balance between effort and exhaustion. They recognized when to push forward and when to rest, when to speak and when silence carried more meaning. Acceptance sharpened awareness, teaching people to move with the world rather than against it. Yet acceptance did not erase questions. People still wondered why misfortune touched some homes more than others, why illness arrived suddenly, why certain prayers seemed unanswered. These questions were carried quietly, not as complaints, but as reflections. Acceptance did not demand certainty. It simply allowed people to live without it. They understood that some answers were not meant to be found in their lifetime. This understanding brought a kind of calm, an internal peace shaped not by contentment, but by clarity. And from this foundation of acceptance, another realization emerges that even in a world defined by hardship, people found moments of meaning that carried them through the darkest times. Which invites a deeper question. How, in a life shaped by endurance, did they find purpose in the ordinary days that passed quietly from dawn to dusk?
Meaning in the medieval world did not come from dramatic events or profound revelations. It emerged gently, woven into the rhythms of ordinary days, unnoticed by those who lived them, but unmistakable to anyone who pauses long enough to listen closely. Medieval people did not expect their lives to be extraordinary. They sought purpose in tasks repeated countless times, in relationships that grew slowly, and in moments so subtle they often vanished in the telling. Yet within these quiet routines lay the essence of their existence, a kind of meaning that modern life often rushes past. Morning brought one of the first sources of meaning, continuity. When a person stepped outside and saw the same fields, the same sky, the same well-trodden paths, they felt grounded. These familiar scenes reminded them that life moved forward with a steady rhythm. They drew comfort from the fact that yesterday's struggles could be faced again today with the same hands, the same knowledge, and the same patience. Continuity was not monotony. It was stability in a world that offered few guarantees. Work, though demanding, carried its own sense of purpose. Each task connected to something larger. Grinding grain meant feeding a family. Mending a roof meant protecting loved ones from storms. Milking animals meant ensuring tomorrow's nourishment. Even the smallest chore contributed to survival. People did not question whether their actions mattered. The results surrounded them in every corner of their homes. Meaning was not sought, but created through effort, repeated so often it became a natural part of identity. Connections with others added another layer of significance. Villagers noticed when someone offered help without being asked, when a child greeted an elder respectfully, when laughter drifted across the fields despite heavy work. These small interactions formed a network of shared humanity, reminding people that they were not alone in facing uncertainty. A shared meal after harvest, a group repairing storm damage together, a neighbor offering a tool in a moment of need. Each gesture shaped the sense that life, though difficult, was carried collectively. Meaning grew out of these bonds, forming a quiet reassurance beneath the surface of every day. Nature, too, played a role in shaping purpose. People watched seasons unfold with the reverence that came from living so close to the land. The first sprouts of spring brought a surge of hope. The long days of summer reminded them of abundance. Autumn carried gratitude and urgency as harvest approached. Even winter, harsh as it was, had moments of stillness that encouraged reflection. The land guided their emotions as much as their labor. Meaning was found in witnessing cycles they could not control, but learned to trust. Children brought meaning in ways both tender and profound. Watching a child take their first steps, speak their first words, or contribute to their first chore offered reassurance that life moved forward even in hardship. Parents saw themselves reflected in their children's growing confidence and felt a sense of continuity stretching from past generations into the future. The struggles endured today would shape the strength of those who came after, giving hardship a sense of purpose. Even rest held meaning. After a long day, when people gathered around the hearth, they found moments to appreciate the warmth, the smell of food, the comfort of familiar voices. They did not need elaborate celebrations to feel content. A quiet evening filled with simple conversation or shared silence offered more solace than they often realized. These moments became markers in their memory, brief pockets of peace that balanced the weight of survival. Meaning also lived in stories. Villagers repeated tales handed down through generations, legends of saints, warnings wrapped in myth, memories of ancestors who endured hard winters or unexpected blessings. Stories did not simply entertain, they connected people to their past, offering lessons, comfort, and a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. When someone told a story by firelight, it reminded listeners that their lives were threads in a long tapestry, woven from the experiences of countless others. Faith infused their days with deeper significance. People believed that their actions, their endurance, and their kindness carried weight beyond the visible world. Whether through prayer, small rituals, or quiet contemplation, they wove their daily activities with spiritual meaning. A farmer blessing his fields before planting, a mother whispering a prayer over her sleeping child, an elder lighting a candle on a feast day. Each act reinforced the belief that life held purpose, even when its challenges felt overwhelming. Even hardship strangely contributed to meaning. Struggle taught resilience, loss taught compassion, uncertainty taught humility. Medieval people did not view hardship as meaningless suffering, but as part of the world's natural order. They found purpose in pushing through adversity, supporting each other, and learning from the moments that tested them. Over time, these experiences shaped their understanding of who they were and how they fit into the world around them. Yet meaning was not always conscious. Often, people realized it only in hindsight. A mother looking at her grown child understood the significance of years spent tending and teaching. An elder reflecting on a life of labor saw that the purpose lay not in any single moment, but in the steady accumulation of days lived with intention. Meaning was less about achievement and more about presence, being part of the land, part of the community, part of a lineage that stretched quietly across centuries. And as we leave this exploration of inner purpose behind, another thought rises. What did these hidden truths, acceptance, routine, quiet purpose, reveal about the deeper wisdom woven into medieval life? And how might those truths echo forward into our own time, shaping the final reflections that await in the closing chapter?
The medieval world often feels distant, an era wrapped in smoke, shaped by hardship, and softened only by the faint glow of memory. Yet when we look closely at the lives of ordinary people, something surprising emerges. Their reality, though marked by struggle, contains lessons that echo quietly into our own time. These lessons were not recorded by historians or carved into monuments. They lived in the small decisions people made each day, in the way they approached labor, and how they carried sorrow, and in the quiet, steady resilience that allowed them to endure. Their wisdom grew from experience rather than instruction, and it formed a kind of knowledge that feels startlingly relevant today. One of the deepest lessons rests in their relationship with limitation. Medieval people did not view limits as failures or injustices. They saw them as part of the landscape of life, as fixed as the seasons or the turning of the earth. Rather than resisting limitations, they adapted. They shaped their expectations around what was possible, not what was ideal. This did not make them passive, it made them practical. They accepted that certain hardships could not be avoided, and in accepting this, they discovered a steadiness that modern life often overlooks. Their resilience came not from fighting the world, but from learning how to move with it. Another quiet lesson lies in their sense of community. Survival demanded cooperation, and the bonds between villagers were built not on convenience, but on necessity. People noticed when a neighbor struggled, when a roof sagged, when a family fell behind on harvest. They stepped in, not because they sought praise, but because they understood that the health of one household affected the well-being of all. In this, they practiced a form of human connection that feels almost rare now, a kind of attentiveness that helped them navigate uncertainty. Their communities were fragile yet strong, held together by countless acts of shared responsibility. Their understanding of time also offers something profound. Life moved slowly, shaped by the pace of the land and the labor of hands. Hours were not measured in minutes, but in tasks. The time it took to grind enough grain, to shear a sheep, to walk to a neighboring field. The slowness of their days allowed them to notice patterns, rhythms, and subtle changes in the world around them. They developed a deep familiarity with their surroundings, the way sunlight fell on certain mornings, the scent of soil after rain, the shift in wind that signaled storms. Their connection to time and place created a sense of grounding that many today seek without realizing it. There is also meaning in the way they approached uncertainty. Medieval people lived with constant unknowns, weather that could ruin months of work, illnesses that arrived without warning, dangers that emerged from forest or night. Yet they did not allow uncertainty to consume them. They found ways to hold it gently, acknowledging what they could not control while focusing on what they could. Their lives were proof that fear does not have to lead to paralysis. Instead, it can foster awareness, caution, and even gratitude for moments of peace. Their approach to emotion adds another layer of understanding. Though they rarely voiced their feelings, they expressed them through action. Love was shown through care, grief through labor done in silence, hope through the planting of seeds in soil that had failed them before. They did not separate emotion from experience. They let one shape the other. Their emotional lives were practical, grounded, and deeply interwoven with their daily routines. From them, we learn that meaning often emerges not from expressing feelings loudly, but from embodying them quietly. Even their relationship with hardship carries wisdom. They viewed suffering not as something that singled them out, but as part of the shared fabric of human existence. This did not make their pain less real, but it made it less isolating. Hardship bound them together, creating a sense of mutual understanding. They found strength in knowing that their struggles were not unique, and in this recognition, they discovered a form of emotional resilience that sustained them through countless winters and trials. Their reverence for stories also holds a lesson. Medieval people used stories to carry wisdom across generations, to explain what they could not prove, to comfort themselves when the world felt too large or too dark. Stories shaped their understanding of life, morality, and possibility. They were reminders that even in the absence of answers, meaning could be woven from imagination, memory, and belief. Stories gave them a way to understand their place in the world and to pass this understanding forward. Taken together, these lessons form a portrait of quiet wisdom, one built not through ease, but through enduring what life required. They remind us that resilience is not always dramatic, that meaning can be found in repetition, and that strength often appears in the form of patience. They teach us that communities thrive when people look beyond themselves, that emotions gain depth through action, and that uncertainty becomes less frightening when met with calm acceptance. And as we absorb these lessons, another question begins to form gently in the background. What remains of their struggles in us today? How do their forgotten hardships echo through the centuries, shaping our fears, our longings, and the way we move through our own uncertain world?
The lives of medieval people may feel distant, shaped by hardships that appear foreign to modern life, yet their struggles echo quietly within us. Their world was one of uncertainty, of labor without pause, of fragile health and fragile hope. And though we no longer walk muddy paths before sunrise or fear the fading light of a winter evening, the feeling beneath those experiences lingers. Something in us still responds to the same pressures: scarcity, change, the need for belonging. the search for meaning. Their forgotten challenges are not as far removed from our lives as we might believe. Today's fears take different shapes, yet the core experience remains familiar. Where medieval people watched the sky for signs of frost or drought, we watch screens for signs of economic shifts, global instability, or unexpected loss. Their worries came from the land. Ours emerge from systems too vast to fully understand. But the sensation is similar, a quiet tension that hums beneath our days, reminding us how thin the line between stability and uncertainty can be. In this, their world mirrors our own more closely than we often realize. Their relationship with work also echoes modern struggles. Though our tools have changed, and our labor no longer requires the same physical endurance, the sense of being pulled forward by necessity remains. Medieval people rose early not because they wished to, but because the day demanded it. Many today wake with the same feeling, compelled by responsibilities that leave little room for rest or reflection. The pressure to keep pace, to maintain stability, to fulfill expectations, these forces continue to shape lives, just as they did centuries ago. The rhythm is different, but the undertone is familiar. Even the emotional landscape of medieval life has quiet parallels now. People hid their fears to protect those they loved. They softened their grief so it wouldn't weigh too heavily on others. They expressed affection through action when words felt difficult. In a world far noisier and more connected, many still do the same. We comfort one another through small gestures, maintain strength in the face of private worries, and seek connection in moments that feel quiet and sincere. The unspoken language of care that shaped medieval households still shapes families today. Their longing for community also persists. Medieval villagers leaned on each other not out of convenience, but out of necessity. Today, though survival no longer depends on neighbors repairing a roof or gathering during harvest, the desire for belonging remains. People still seek the reassurance of shared experiences, still look for those who understand their struggles, still feel the ache of isolation when those connections weaken. Medieval life reminds us that even in a world built on individualism, the human need for community remains unchanged. The way medieval people found meaning also resonates. They discovered purpose not in extraordinary events, but in the ordinary tasks that filled their days. They found value in effort, in care, in continuity. And while modern life often encourages us to chase ambition or novelty, there is something grounding in the medieval perspective, a reminder that meaning can live quietly, in moments that seem small, but feel deeply human. A warm meal, a steady routine, a peaceful evening, a shared smile. These simple experiences still anchor us, just as they anchored those who lived centuries before. Their acceptance of uncertainty offers another reflection. Medieval people moved through a world they could not fully control, holding their unanswered questions gently instead of allowing them to overwhelm them. Today's world is filled with unknowns just as powerful, though they come from different sources. The medieval response, calm endurance, patient adaptation, and trust in something larger than themselves, offers a form of wisdom still relevant. Acceptance does not mean surrender. It means acknowledging limits while continuing to act with intention. Even the presence of fear remains recognizable. Medieval villagers feared the dark, the mysterious, the unseen. We fear different shadows, the future, loss, change, the possibility of being alone. Though the shapes differ, the sensation is the same. A quiet stir within, a hesitation before moving forward. Their lives remind us that fear is not a flaw, but a companion that all humans carry. What matters is not eliminating it, but learning how to move despite it. Perhaps the strongest echo lies in resilience. Medieval people endured winters that tested their strength, illnesses that threatened their families, and shortages that forced them to stretch every resource.
Modern life carries its own trials, emotional exhaustion, uncertainty, pressures that wear down the spirit. Yet the same resilience persists, the same ability to adapt, to continue, to rebuild when something breaks. Their struggles, though shaped by earth and weather, illuminate strengths that have never left us. In their stories, we find reminders rather than instructions. They remind us to slow down, to appreciate stillness, to recognize that purpose often comes quietly. They remind us that connection, whether with family, community, or something larger than ourselves, gives life depth. They remind us that hardship can shape meaning rather than erase it. Their lives were difficult, but they carried a kind of clarity that feels almost rare now, a sense of presence that emerged from knowing how fragile each day could be. And so their struggles echo into our own lives gently, like distant footsteps on an old path. They speak through the routines we repeat, the emotions we hold close, the moments of silence that reveal what truly matters. They remind us that humanity is not defined by comfort or progress, but by endurance, compassion, and the quiet search for meaning that spans across centuries. As the echoes fade, one final truth lingers. The medieval world may belong to the past, but the people who lived within it shaped a legacy of resilience that continues to breathe through us. In understanding their hidden struggles, we come a little closer to understanding ourselves.